The Midnight Woods, the haunting experience that predicted tragic events. One night, I took my regular route home from work. I got out at midnight, so it was probably 15 or so. My town is rather quiet and uninteresting. There are many trees everywhere, but few people or homes. It was midsummer and around 75 degrees, so I had my convertible top down. I was on this road near my house with a cornfield on one side and a patch of woods on the other. I was driving down the street at about 50 m/h when I heard a loud, blood-curdling woman scream come from one side of the road, but I couldn't tell which one. I quickly came to a stop by slamming on the brakes and listened. There was a woman's cry for help from the left side in the woods. I got out of my car and grabbed the baton from my back seat, and I walked towards the woods and called back, "Who is out?" I yelled at the woman to keep screaming so I could find her, and she would yell help. About every 10 seconds or so, I would run in that direction screaming back, but pretty soon I realized that no matter how far into the woods I went, the woman's yells never seemed to get any closer or louder. If anything, they were always at the same distance. Despite the fact that I was running straight for the screams, I yelled, "Tell me where you..." I turned around and began running back the way I had come. I ran and ran until I could see my car's flashing headlights on the side of the road beyond the trees. The entire time I was running back, I could still hear the woman's screams, but they were at the same distance, no matter how close to my car I got. I didn't like this and began to feel like I was walking into some kind of trap. I sped away from the scene in my car, terrified, feeling as though she were stalking me. I dialed to report the incident to the police in case they wanted to look into it. Even though I was exhausted and had already told a few family members and friends about the weird incident, I decided to leave that place and get on with my life. But a week later, I was horrified to learn that a 30-something woman's body had been discovered in the woods by a hiker with his dog. Oddly, there were no indications of foul play, and the body's reported discovery was close to where I had heard screams. Given how large a patch of woods is, I can't help but think that finding the body there would be a huge coincidence. Stranded in the snow, a thrilling encounter on a lonely highway. I had two cars at the time of this story, a 2013 BMW 3 Series and a 2006 Ford F-150, which I was driving on this particular night. I had my snowboarding gear in the bed of the truck. I was about 45 minutes from my friend's cabin at this point. It was late, like 10 p.m. It was pitch black on these roads and it was snowing. There were like no other cars on the road up there besides me. I was driving from Brooklyn to Vermont to my friend John's. That night was no exception, occurring at maybe the worst conceivable moment on the quietest, darkest road. Suddenly, my engine starts to totally overheat into the red zone. I'd only recently received my vehicle back from the repair. I pull over to the side, slow down, and wait for it to cool off once again. Then I carefully re-enter the road, but even at my slowest pace, the needle had returned to the red, and the engine was once more overheating. The T-Mobile signal was non-existent on this route, so I had to contact John. I had to stop and turn off the vehicle after attempting to identify the issue beneath the hood in the dark and snow. When I realized I was in trouble and couldn't even phone for assistance, I got inside the vehicle to turn it back on and at least wait. The truck didn't appear to overheat while idling in the heat. I tried to drive again, but the same thing happened, so I had to wait for about 10 minutes before I saw a passing car. I put my hazards on, opened the door, and waved my arms. The passing car stopped. It was a small Toyota. The driver rolled down his window. I thanked him for stopping and asked if I could use his phone. He said yes. I explained the situation and told him my truck was overheating and was therefore undrivable. He then asked if I'm all alone. I paused for a second and said yeah. He reached for his phone and handed it to me. Based on the bars on his phone, he must have been a locale. When I phoned my buddy John, he picked up the phone, and when I asked him what I should do, he advised me to call a certain local towing firm and promised to pick me up. He agreed to come over when I told him my specific position, so I contacted the towing firm he recommended and asked for help. Throughout both phone calls, the man in his car kept an eye on me. After finishing my phone calls, I returned the man's phone and thanked him. He said, "You're welcome," and then he rolled down his window and began driving down the snowy road into the darkness ahead. I watched as his taillights completely vanished as he descended below the top of the hilly road above. Now that I was by myself again, I got back into my idling truck to be in the warmth. I briefly turned off the headlights to get an idling look. It was dark outside the windows, and when I say that I couldn't see a thing, I'm not exaggerating. I waited in the vehicle for so long that I was unable to complete anything that required an internet connection. I resorted to playing games on my phone for 20 minutes until there's a bang at my passenger side glass. The individual was hard to see through the window since it was too dark outside, and the headlights weren't doing much to illuminate the truck's sides. I heard a man yelling at me to open the door because he was freezing. I also heard him trying to open the door on his own, but it was locked. I shined my flashlight to the window, but it did little to help me see anyone outside. All I could make out was a man wearing an extremely large black coat with a hood over his head. I yelled back, "What's wrong?" And the unidentified man outside responded, "I'm lost and stranded and need to get out of the cold." Unsure of this, I sat there anxiously trying to think of what to say to him to show he isn't someone trying to hurt me. Before I could even think of what to say, he began abrasively trying to still open the locked door and then pounding even harder on the glass. Still screaming for help in the heat of the moment, I decided to listen to my gut. I put the truck in drive and he realized this and started pounding harder on the window to break it. I drove the truck onto the road and brought it up to 30 miles per hour despite the damage I was surely doing to the overheating engine. But then, as I crested the hill on the road, I noticed the reflection of taillights coming my way on the side of the road as I passed the parked car. I realized it was the same Toyota from earlier, the one that the man was driving. I slowed down and lowered the window to see if the man was in the car, but I didn't see anything. It appeared as though the car was empty. The man who was banging on my window was him, and my taillights illuminated footprints in the snow, indicating that he was trying to trick me into opening the door to do whatever. I continued driving my truck despite the fact that I was up the engine, but I didn't care at that point. A few minutes later, I pulled over when I noticed headlights coming from the other side. I was excited and wanted to cheer when I realized it was the tow truck. I flashed my lights and the tow truck pulled to the side. When the driver emerged, I told him what had happened, and he joked that he had arrived just in time. He then said, "Well then, we better do this quickly." It took him about 15 minutes to get the truck attached, and during that time, the Toyota never passed us. It's possible that he turned around and went the other way for precisely this reason. I called John once again on the tow truck driver's phone and instructed him to just meet us at the body shop to do the remainder. The body shop rebuilt the damaged water pump in my truck that was the cause of the overheating as John and I continued to go skiing that weekend. After a few weeks, I sold that truck. I'm happy I didn't down my window or open the doors to the man who was attempting to get into my car, because in that situation, I could have been killed and no one would have ever known who had done it. Night drive terror, a scary encounter with my girlfriend. At the age of 17, I met my first girlfriend. Because my parents divorced when I was 11, I was living with my mother at the time. I invited my girlfriend out on a date one day, and she agreed. We both had jobs. I worked at a local grocery store, and she worked at a Starbucks. We both worked day shifts and were in our senior year of high school. I asked her on a date that day because it was a Friday, and we didn't have much homework after work. I picked up my girlfriend from her house, and we went to a small restaurant 10 minutes away from my house because that's all I could afford at the time we ate. Then we went back to her place to spend some time together. By then, it was dark. She grumbled about how short our date night was, and I told her I couldn't take her anywhere else since it would have to be paid for. He agreed that we would go on a night drive. We drove in town. Then we drove on some vacant streets. Rode in the woods. Eventually, the pavement ended, and we were on a dirt road. I had to pee really bad. I told my girlfriend, and she had to pee as well. We pulled over and got out of my car for some reason. We smelled an awful, indescribable smell. I excused it as another person who also pulled over to do their business. My girlfriend actually gagged from the smell. I told her that we would pee real quick, then go back in the car. There was a small, flat area that was the best place to pee. We did our business there, and then headed back to my car when we heard what sounded like a twig snapping on our left side. Afraid that it was an animal, we hurried back to my car before I could open the door. I then heard a scream of fear or pain coming from the direction my girlfriend and I had just peed. I told my girlfriend to get in my car while I go investigate, despite her pleas for me not to. I locked the doors and headed in the direction of where we were when I heard the scream again. For some reason, I lost all courage to go investigate since I had hurt him much closer. But since it sounded like it was coming from the same direction as when my girlfriend and I heard the twig snapping in, I went to my phone, turned on the flash, and took a picture instead. When the flash went off, I noticed a man standing there with a blue tarp in front of him and a white shirt with black stripes on it. I sped to my car, unlocked the doors, put it in drive, and floored it. My girlfriend pressed me for details. She could see I was terrified, and I promised her I would explain later. When we returned to the seedier part of town and drove back to my girlfriend's house, she was in her room when I told her I had seen the man with the blue tarp in front of him, simply standing there. We were both frightened when I showed her the photo, and since it was a Friday and there was no work or school the next day, she agreed to let me stay the night. This was by far the scariest event of my life, and we are no longer dating.